The vampire king spent his 100th day as a beggar, cold and forgotten on hospital steps. But when the exhausted nurse pressed her wedding ring into his palm, whispering, "Sell this for food," something ancient cracked inside his chest. What she didn't know, her simple kindness had just bound her to the most dangerous creature alive. Adrian Blackthorne pressed his back against the cold concrete steps of St. Mary's Hospital, the 100th dawn breaking over the city's skyline in shades of gray and amber. His fingers traced the rough fabric of his stolen coat, each thread a reminder of the degradation he had chosen, the mask he wore to walk among mortals undetected. The scent of antiseptic and despair drifted from the automatic doors behind him, mixing with exhaust fumes and the metallic tang of approaching rain. For 99 days he had sat in doorways and alleyways, watching humanity parade past in their endless procession of selfishness and indifference. Coins had been thrown at his feet like scraps to a dog, but never with kindness, only with the desire to be rid of him quickly. The vampire king had once ruled with compassion, had believed in the nobility that could exist within mortal hearts. But 3 centuries of witnessing wars and betrayals had carved that faith from his chest like a surgeon's blade. This experiment had been his final test, his last attempt to find evidence that humans deserve the protection he had once offered so freely. If he could not find one genuine act of selfless mercy in 100 days, he would return to his underground kingdom and give the order that would begin humanity's end. The fluorescent lights inside the hospital buzzed like dying insects, and through the glass doors he could see the night shift preparing to depart. Nurses moved with practiced exhaustion, their scrubs wrinkled from 12-hour battles against death and suffering. One figure caught his attention, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her steps heavy with fatigue but her spine still straight with determination. Elena Martinez pushed through the doors, her wedding ring catching the harsh artificial light as she fumbled for her car keys. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Adrian watched as she noticed him sitting on the steps, her brown eyes meeting his for a moment that stretched like eternity. Most people looked through him now, their gazes sliding past as if he were invisible, but this woman saw him with the clarity of someone who spent her days looking into the faces of the dying. She stopped, her tired feet carrying her back to where he sat, and reached into her purse with hands that trembled from exhaustion. What she pulled out was not coins or crumpled bills, but the simple gold band from her left hand, still warm from her skin. She knelt beside him, without regard for her clean scrubs touching the dirty concrete, and pressed the ring into his palm with a gentleness that made something crack inside his chest like ice breaking on a spring river. "Sell this for food," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just given away everything valuable she owned. The moment the metal touched his supernatural skin, ancient magic stirred to life like electricity through his veins. The ring of binding, a law so old it had been forgotten by most of vampire kind, activated with the force of a thunderclap only he could hear. The invisible tether snapped into place between them, binding him to this mortal woman with chains stronger than iron, and Adrian realized with growing horror that his simple experiment had become something far more catastrophic than he had ever imagined. Elena walked away into the gray morning, unaware that she had just changed the fate of 2 worlds with a single act of compassion. Adrian remained frozen on the hospital steps, the wedding ring burning against his palm like a brand, its simple gold surface reflecting light that hurt his ancient eyes. Through his enhanced senses, he could read the metal's history as clearly as words on a page. The ring had been purchased by a man named Carlos Martinez, bought with money saved from construction wages, slipped onto Elena's finger during a ceremony in a small church surrounded by friends who could barely afford to attend. It had been worn through 2 years of marriage before cancer took Carlos, leaving Elena alone with medical debt and a mother whose failing heart required constant care. The warmth trapped in the gold spoke of countless hours spent holding patients' hands, of Elena removing it each night to scrub away the day's suffering from her skin, of the way she touched it when she needed courage. Adrian rose from the steps and followed her scent through the waking city, his supernatural speed allowing him to move through shadows while remaining undetected. Elena's apartment building stood in a neighborhood where hope went to die, its brick facade crumbling like the dreams of its residents. Through windows that had never known expensive curtains, Adrian watched Elena climb 3 flights of stairs to a door marked 3B. Inside, the apartment was smaller than most vampires' closets, its furniture worn but clean, its walls decorated with medical certificates and photographs of happier times. Elena's mother lay in a hospital bed that dominated the living room, her breathing shallow and labored, oxygen tubes snaking from her nose like transparent serpents. The older woman opened eyes that had once been as bright as her daughter's and smiled with effort that spoke of love stronger than disease. Elena sat on the bed's edge and took her mother's hand, and it was then that the woman noticed the missing ring. "Where is your wedding band, mija?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the authority that mothers never lose. Elena looked down at her bare finger, and Adrian saw her struggle with the lie that would spare her mother worry. "I gave it to someone who needed it more than I do," she finally said, and her mother's eyes filled with tears that spoke of understanding rather than anger. "Some people need food more than I need jewelry," Elena continued, and Adrian felt the tether between them pulse with power at her words. Her mother reached up with trembling fingers to touch Elena's cheek, and whispered that Carlos would have been proud of her generosity, that helping others was the highest calling a person could follow. Adrian pressed his face against the window glass and felt something he had not experienced in centuries, the desire to protect rather than destroy. The binding compelled him now, made it impossible to simply walk away and forget this mortal woman who had given away her most precious possession to save a stranger. But revealing his true nature would paint a target on her back, would bring down upon her head every vampire who sought to use her as a weapon against him. He remained outside her window until the sun climbed high enough to force him into deeper shadows, watching as Elena prepared for sleep after a night spent fighting death in hospital corridors. Only when she finally closed her eyes did Adrian allow himself to disappear into the darkness, the wedding ring clutched in his fist like a talisman against the storm he knew was coming. The entrance to Adrian's kingdom lay beneath the city's oldest cemetery, hidden behind a mausoleum that bore his family name, though none of the humans who read it suspected the truth. Stone steps descended into darkness that welcomed him like an old friend, leading to chambers carved from living rock and decorated with treasures gathered across centuries of rule. Eternal flames danced in bronze braziers, their light revealing tapestries that depicted vampire history in threads of gold and crimson. The council chamber stretched before him like a cathedral, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that had never known sunlight. Mordecai stood waiting beside the throne, his ancient face carved from marble and time, his eyes holding the wisdom and cruelty of 3 millennia. Seraphina paced near the chamber's far wall, her military bearing evident in every sharp movement, her hand resting on the sword hilt that had tasted the blood of 1,000 enemies. Damien lounged in a chair that belonged to Adrian's absent queen, his younger brother's handsome features hiding ambition that burned brighter than the brazier's flames. All three turned as Adrian entered, their supernatural senses immediately detecting the change in their king, the scent of binding magic that clung to him like perfume. Mordecai spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of ages. "The experiment is complete," he said. And it was not a question, but a statement of fact, visible in Adrian's posture and expression. Adrian moved to his throne and sat heavily, Elena's wedding ring still warm in his palm. "I found what I was looking for," he said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. The silence that followed stretched like a drawn blade before Seraphina's laughter shattered it into pieces. "One act of kindness in 100 days," she said, "and you call this proof of human worth." Damien leaned forward with interest that made Adrian's blood run cold. "Tell us about this human who has so impressed our king," he said, his tone light but his eyes hungry for weakness. Adrian described Elena without naming her, spoke of her sacrifice and compassion, while carefully omitting details that might lead his counsel to her door. But Mordecai was too old and too wise to be deceived by partial truths. "You have been bound," he said, and the words fell into the chamber like stones into still water. "The ring of binding has activated, and this human now carries your protection whether she knows it or not." Seraphina stopped pacing, her hand tightening on her sword. "Then she must be eliminated before our enemies discover her existence," she said, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "A vampire king's weakness is a weapon in every rival's hand." Adrian rose from his throne with speed that made the flames flicker. "No harm will come to her," he said, and his voice carried the absolute authority of centuries of rule. But Damien smiled with satisfaction that spoke of plans already in motion. "Too late, brother," he said. "Word of your little experiment has already reached interested ears. Every vampire court from here to the old country will be watching to see how you handle this unprecedented situation." Mordecai nodded gravely. "The binding cannot be broken except by death," he said, "either yours or hers. Until then, she remains a liability that our enemies will exploit without mercy." Adrian felt the weight of Elena's ring in his palm and knew that his attempt to prove humanity's worthlessness had instead doomed the one human who had proven him wrong. 3 blocks away, Elena stood at her apartment window looking out at shadows that moved wrong, at darkness that seemed to watch her with eyes she could not see. She touched her bare ring finger and wondered why the stranger's face haunted her thoughts, why she felt as though giving away her wedding ring had started something that could never be stopped. Outside her building, vampires old enough to remember when the city was forest began their surveillance, waiting for orders from masters who saw in Elena Martinez not a woman of compassion, but a key to the vampire king's heart. Adrian Blackthorne shed his beggar's rags like a snake shedding old skin, transforming himself into Adrian Blake with the practiced ease of centuries spent manipulating mortal perception. The expensive suit fitted his frame perfectly, tailored in London by craftsmen who never questioned why their clients' measurements never changed over decades of patronage. His hair, clean and styled, caught light like polished obsidian, and the contacts he wore turned his supernatural silver eyes to a more human shade of gray. The identity he assumed came complete with financial records stretching back decades, charitable foundations that existed on paper and in carefully maintained bank accounts, and a reputation for mysterious philanthropy that explained both his wealth and his reclusive nature. Elena Martinez stood in the break room of St. Mary's Hospital, stirring sugar into coffee that had been brewing since the previous shift, when the hospital administrator found her with news that would change everything. A private medical facility had requested her specifically, offering a salary that made her hands shake as she read the number. The administrator seemed as surprised as Elena, mentioning that the facility's owner, Adrian Blake, had specifically asked for the nurse who worked the night shift in the emergency department. The one known for her exceptional patient care and unwavering compassion. Elena's first instinct was suspicion, because good fortune had been a stranger to her life for so long that she had forgotten its face. But the bills for her mother's care mounted higher each week, and desperation made the decision easier than it should have been. The Blake Medical Center occupied a converted mansion in the city's historic district, its Gothic architecture speaking of old money and older secrets. Inside, state-of-the-art medical equipment gleamed under crystal chandeliers, creating a surreal blend of ancient elegance and modern technology. Elena's new supervisor, Dr. Sarah Chen, welcomed her with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, explaining that Mr. Blake had heard remarkable things about Elena's skills and wanted to offer her the opportunity to work with patients who required the most delicate care. The facility specialized in rare conditions and experimental treatments, Dr. Chen explained, cases that demanded not just medical expertise, but the kind of emotional intelligence that could comfort patients facing impossible odds. Elena's first day revealed the truth behind her reputation as she moved through the facility's corridors like a dancer who had found her proper stage. Her hands held steady during delicate procedures, her voice remained calm when delivering difficult news, and her presence seemed to ease suffering in ways that medical science could not fully explain. Adrian watched from observation rooms and security monitors, his supernatural senses allowing him to perceive the aura of peace that surrounded Elena as she worked. Each patient she touched seemed to improve beyond what their conditions should have allowed, as if her compassion itself possessed healing properties that defied rational explanation. In the facility's private wing, Elena tended to a young girl whose leukemia had resisted every treatment, and Adrian observed as the child's pain visibly decreased under Elena's gentle care. The girl asked Elena why she did not wear a wedding ring, and Elena's answer carried no trace of regret as she explained that sometimes people needed help more than we needed the things we treasured. That evening, Elena called her mother from her small apartment, her voice bright with excitement for the first time in months. The job paid 3 times her hospital salary, she explained, enough to afford the experimental heart treatment her mother needed, enough to move them both to a better neighborhood where the sound of sirens would not punctuate every night. Her mother listened with joy, tempered by maternal concern, asking about the mysterious benefactor who had offered such generous employment to a daughter he had never met. Elena admitted that Adrian Blake intrigued her in ways she could not fully explain, that his kindness seemed genuine despite the mystery that surrounded him like expensive cologne, and that something in his gray eyes suggested depths of experience that belied his apparent age. Weeks dissolved into a rhythm of shared purpose as Adrian and Elena worked side by side, his centuries of accumulated knowledge allowing him to pose as a brilliant medical consultant whose insights bordered on the miraculous. His understanding of anatomy came from battlefield experience treating wounds that would have killed lesser creatures, his knowledge of pain from enduring tortures that had lasted decades, and his comprehension of death from watching civilizations rise and fall like waves against an eternal shore. Elena accepted his expertise without question, attributing his unusual insights to extensive study and natural intuition, never suspecting that the man beside her had learned medicine from plague doctors and battlefield surgeons whose names were lost to history. Their first major case together involved a homeless man brought in with injuries that spoke of violence and neglect, his body bearing scars that told stories of a life lived in society's forgotten corners. Elena worked with fierce determination to save someone that most medical professionals would have written off as hopeless, her hands moving with surgical precision while she whispered encouragement to a patient who had not heard kind words in years. Adrian found himself moved by her refusal to let circumstances determine a person's worth, watching as she fought for this stranger's life with the same intensity she would have shown for a wealthy benefactor. When the man's heart stopped during surgery, Elena refused to accept defeat, performing CPR with tears streaming down her cheeks until Adrian's supernatural strength helped her achieve the rhythm that brought life back to dying flesh. The case of a 7-year-old boy with terminal brain cancer tested Elena's emotional reserves in ways that Adrian could barely witness, watching as she sat beside the child's bed, reading stories and playing games while his parents wept in the hallway. Elena's natural empathy allowed her to speak to the boy about death without fear, helping him understand that some journeys ended not because they were failures, but because they were complete. Adrian observed as she held the child's hand during his final moments, her presence transforming what should have been a scene of tragedy into something approaching peace. Later that night, as Elena sat alone in the facility's chapel weeping for a child she had known for only 3 days, Adrian felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with vampire binding and everything to do with recognition of a soul that matched his own lost compassion. Their work treating victims of gang violence brought them together in ways that transcended professional collaboration. Elena's medical skills, complemented by Adrian's uncanny ability to anticipate complications before they developed. During one particularly difficult night, as they fought to save a teenager whose wounds spoke of a city that devoured its young, Elena noticed how Adrian's hands remained steady and cold even under the surgical light's heat. "You have vampire pale skin," she teased during a brief break between surgeries, not knowing how close to truth her joke had wandered. Adrian's laugh carried centuries of irony, as he agreed that he had always been sensitive to sunlight, watching Elena's face for any sign of suspicion, while his heart performed gymnastics that should have been impossible for the undead. As dawn approached and their shift neared its end, Elena shared the story of her father's death when she was 16, how his final words had been about helping others regardless of their ability to pay for care. She spoke of her mother's illness with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had learned that love sometimes meant watching people die, and of her decision to become a nurse because healing others helped heal the parts of herself that grief had broken. Adrian listened with the attention of someone who had forgotten how beautiful human resilience could be, realizing that Elena embodied every noble ideal he had once believed possible in mortal hearts. When she fell asleep in the break room chair after 36 straight hours of work, Adrian covered her with his jacket and found himself standing guard over her rest, like a supernatural sentinel, understanding for the first time in centuries what it meant to care more about another's well-being than his own survival. Their first kiss happened in the facility's garden during a quiet moment after they had successfully saved a young mother's life, Elena turning to Adrian with joy shining in her eyes like captured starlight, her lips meeting his with a tenderness that awakened emotions he had thought buried forever beneath centuries of cynicism and blood. Adrian's happiness shattered like crystal against stone when Mordecai's urgent summons reached him through channels that bypassed human communication entirely, the ancient vampire's mental voice carrying news that made his dead heart skip with terror. The council chamber felt colder than usual when Adrian descended from the world above, leaving Elena sleeping peacefully in her apartment while he faced revelations that threatened to destroy everything he had begun to build with her. Mordecai stood before a table covered in photographs and documents, surveillance images that showed Elena's building from multiple angles, her daily routes to work, even pictures of her mother taken through hospital windows by watchers who moved through shadows like smoke. Rival vampire clans from across the continent had learned of the binding, Mordecai explained with grim satisfaction, their spies having detected the magical signature that connected Vampire King to mortal woman like a beacon visible to supernatural senses. Ancient law demanded that any human bound to vampire royalty must undergo testing within one lunar cycle or face elimination by the vampire courts themselves, a tradition that had prevented such complications for millennia. Serafina emerged from the chamber's darker corners, carrying reports that made Adrian's blood run colder than winter, intelligence gathered by her network of spies and assassins who moved through the supernatural underworld like ghosts seeking secrets. Enemy vampires had been spotted near Elena's apartment building, she announced, old creatures whose names carried weight in vampire society. Scouts for powers that could challenge Adrian's rule if they found sufficient weakness to exploit. The surveillance footage she projected onto the chamber's walls showed figures that moved too quickly for human cameras to capture clearly. But Adrian's supernatural vision recognized faces that belonged to vampires who had been ancient when Rome was young. Damien lounged in his chair with satisfaction that spoke of long-anticipated vindication, his handsome features unable to hide the ambition that had always burned behind his loyalty. "The time has come for choices, brother," he said with false sympathy, that fooled no one present. "You must decide whether you value your throne or your pet human more highly, because keeping both may prove impossible." His words carried the weight of challenge barely disguised as counsel, and Adrian understood that his brother saw opportunity in crisis, a chance to claim the crown that primogeniture had denied him. Meanwhile, Elena walked through her daily life increasingly aware that something fundamental had shifted in the world around her. Shadows that seemed to watch her movements, the feeling of eyes upon her even when she stood alone in empty rooms, and strange dreams that featured silver eyes and voices speaking languages she did not recognize. Her mother's old dog, a terrier named Cisco, who had never shown fear of anything larger than a mailman, began cowering whenever Adrian visited their apartment, whimpering and hiding under furniture as if sensing predatory instincts that human perception could not detect. Elena's best friend Maria cornered her during their lunch break at the old hospital, her concern evident in every word as she questioned Adrian's mysterious background and urged caution in a relationship that had developed with supernatural speed. Maria had done research that revealed Adrian Blake's charitable foundation existed only on paper, that his medical credentials came from universities that had no record of his attendance, and that his personal history contained gaps that no amount of internet searching could fill. Elena defended Adrian with passion that surprised even herself, arguing that some people valued privacy above publicity, that his kindness toward her mother and his skill in the medical center proved his character better than any background check could reveal. But privately, she found herself wondering what she really knew about the man who had entered her life like a guardian angel bearing gifts too perfect to be entirely real, whose skin remained cold even in the warmest rooms, whose eyes sometimes reflected light in ways that reminded her of nocturnal predators, and whose presence in her life had coincided with shadows that moved wrong and dreams that felt more like memories than fantasies. Elena Martinez walked through the narrow alley that served as a shortcut between the Blake Medical Center and the bus stop, her footsteps echoing off brick walls that seemed to press closer together as midnight approached. The weight of exhaustion pulled at her shoulders after another 16-hour shift, but satisfaction lightened her steps because they had saved 3 lives that night, including a construction worker whose heart had stopped twice during surgery. Her medical bag bounced against her hip with each step, filled with supplies she carried out of habit, and the small bottle of holy water Father Miguel had blessed for her after her father's funeral, a talisman she kept more from sentiment than faith. The shadows between the buildings moved wrong, flowing like liquid darkness against the natural patterns of streetlight and moon, and Elena felt her pulse quicken with instincts honed by years of working in dangerous neighborhoods. 3 figures stepped from doorways that had appeared empty moments before, their movements too fluid and predatory to be entirely human, their eyes reflecting the distant streetlight like those of nocturnal hunters. The leader spoke with an accent that belonged to no country Elena could identify, his voice carrying amusement that made her skin crawl as he addressed her by name and asked how it felt to be the Vampire King's pet human. Elena's first reaction was disbelief that shifted quickly to terror as the man's features became visible in the dim light, revealing skin too pale and perfect to be natural, canine teeth that extended past normal human proportions, and fingernails that had grown into claws while she watched. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, backing against the alley wall while her rational mind tried to process what she was seeing. But the second vampire laughed with sounds that belonged in nightmares and explained that their king had become pathetically attached to a mortal woman who would make an excellent weapon against him. Elena's medical training kicked in as panic threatened to overwhelm her thoughts, her hands moving automatically to her bag while she calculated distances and escape routes with the same precision she used during medical emergencies. The holy water came out first, the small plastic bottle feeling inadequate against supernatural predators, but burning their skin like acid when she threw its contents at the nearest vampire's face. His screams of rage and pain bought her seconds to grab IV tubing from her medical supplies, twisting the clear plastic into the shape of a cross while backing toward the alley's mouth and praying that folklore contained more truth than her rational mind wanted to accept. The improvised holy symbols seemed to create a barrier the vampires could not cross, their advance halting as if they had struck an invisible wall, but their leader snarled with fury and began circling to find an angle of attack that would avoid the blessed plastic. Elena held her makeshift weapon with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear. Her nursing experience with violent patients having taught her that projecting confidence could sometimes prevent attacks from escalating. But these were not humans driven by pain or mental illness, and her improvised defenses would not hold them forever. The temperature in the alley dropped, as if winter had arrived in the space between heartbeats. And Adrian Blackthorne materialized from shadows that had been empty an instant before. His transformation from the man she knew into something magnificent and terrifying happening so quickly that Elena's eyes struggled to track the change. His expensive suit remained immaculate despite his supernatural speed, but his human disguise had fallen away to reveal eyes that glowed with silver fire, skin that seemed to emit its own luminescence, and fangs that extended past his lips like ivory daggers designed for killing. The three enemy vampires turned from Elena to face this new threat, their confident taunting replaced by wariness, as they recognized power that dwarfed their own ancient strength. And their leader spoke Adrian's true name with respect, tinged by defiance that would prove fatal. Adrian moved through the confined space of the alley like death-given form, his centuries of combat experience evident in every calculated strike and defensive maneuver, his royal vampiric abilities unleashed without restraint for the first time since Elena had known him. The first attacker died before Elena could blink, Adrian's claws opening the creature's throat with surgical precision, while his other hand caught the falling body and hurled it against the brick wall with force that left cracks in the ancient mortar. The second vampire lasted longer, managing to land a blow that tore Adrian's shirt but failed to penetrate skin hardened by centuries of survival, before Adrian's retaliation removed the creature's head with a sound like breaking branches. The leader proved more formidable, his own supernatural speed allowing him to match Adrian's attacks while retreating toward the alley's mouth, but royal vampire blood carried advantages that age alone could not provide, and Adrian's final strike lifted his opponent from the ground and threw him through the air to impact against a dumpster with metallic thunder that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Elena watched this display of otherworldly power with emotions that cycled between horror and fascination, unable to look away from the man she loved as he stood among the destruction he had created, his chest rising and falling with exertion that seemed more psychological than physical. When Adrian turned toward her, his fangs still extended and his eyes blazing with predatory fire, Elena felt no fear, despite knowing that she was looking upon a creature capable of ending her life with casual ease. "You are really him," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The vampire king they were talking about, and Adrian's nod carried centuries of weariness as his supernatural features began to fade back toward human appearance. The Blake Medical Center felt different as Adrian led Elena through corridors that had become familiar over weeks of shared work, the comfortable spaces now carrying undertones of deception that made every shadow seem deeper and every sound more ominous. His private office, decorated with medical journals and humanitarian awards that she now realized must be fabrications, became the setting for revelations that would reshape Elena's understanding of reality itself. Adrian began with the experiment, explaining how 3 centuries of witnessing human cruelty had convinced him that mortals deserved extinction, how his 100 days disguised as a beggar had been intended as final proof of humanity's worthlessness before he gave orders that would begin a supernatural war against the living world. Elena listened with growing incredulity as he described vampire society hidden beneath the city streets, ancient laws that governed creatures she had thought existed only in movies and folklore, and the binding ritual that had activated when she pressed her wedding ring into his palm with genuine compassion. The experiment had failed, Adrian continued, because instead of confirming human selfishness, he had discovered human nobility in its purest form. But that failure had triggered consequences that now threatened both their worlds. Elena's reaction moved through stages like grief, beginning with disbelief that gave way to anger as she realized the extent to which her life had been manipulated by someone she had trusted with her heart. "You created a job for me," she accused, her voice rising with fury that made Adrian step backward despite his supernatural strength. "You built an entire medical facility just to watch me like some kind of laboratory experiment." And his acknowledgement of the truth hit her like physical blows. Fear came next as the implications settled into her mind. The understanding that supernatural predators now hunted her because of choices she had made in ignorance. But strange acceptance followed, as puzzle pieces began forming a complete picture in her thoughts. The signs had been there all along, she realized. His skin that remained cold even in heated rooms. His preference for working night shifts, his medical knowledge that seemed to come from sources no textbook could provide, and the way shadows bent around him as if light itself recognized his supernatural nature. "Your eyes reflect light like an animal's," she said, remembering moments when she had attributed the phenomenon to tricks of fluorescent lighting. "And you never eat food when we work together. Only drink coffee that you never seem to finish." Elena's anger shifted towards something resembling hurt, as she asked why he had not trusted her with the truth. But Adrian's explanation of vampire law and the dangers that honesty would have created for her made logical sense even as it failed to heal the emotional wounds that deception had opened. She demanded to see his true world, to understand the society that now claimed her as member, whether she had chosen membership or not. And Adrian's reluctance only strengthened her resolve to face whatever awaited in the depths beneath the city. The descent into Adrian's underground kingdom felt like traveling backward through time. Stone steps worn smooth by centuries of supernatural feet, leading to chambers that predated human civilization in this part of the world. Elena's first glimpse of vampire society stole her breath with its alien beauty: marble corridors lit by flames that burned without fuel, tapestries depicting historical events from perspectives no human had witnessed, and architecture that combined Gothic grandeur with practical defensibility. The council chambers stretched before them like a cathedral designed by beings who had never known the comfort of sunlight, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the eternal flame's illumination. Mordecai stood beside the throne with ancient dignity that made Elena feel like a child despite her 28 years, his eyes holding wisdom accumulated over millennia, but also coldness that suggested compassion was a luxury he had abandoned long ago. His analysis of the binding situation treated Elena like a mathematical problem rather than a person, his clinical description of vampire law making her feel like evidence in a case rather than a woman whose life had been turned upside down by forces beyond her control. Serafina emerged from shadows near the chamber's walls, her military bearing evident in every precise movement, her contempt for Elena's mortality radiating like heat from a forge as she argued that humans had no place in vampire politics regardless of ancient binding rituals. Damien approached with charm that felt rehearsed and predatory, his handsome features hiding ambition that Elena recognized from her experience with hospital administrators who smiled while planning budget cuts that would cost lives. His attempts to win her favor with compliments and false sympathy only convinced Elena that Adrian's younger brother saw her as either a tool to be used or an obstacle to be removed, and she responded to his overtures with polite distance that made his eyes flash with annoyance. Elena stood her ground despite being surrounded by creatures who could end her life before she could scream, her nursing experience with aggressive patients having taught her that showing fear often encouraged violence, while projecting confidence could sometimes prevent escalation. "If I am bound to this world whether I chose it or not," she announced to the assembled vampires, "then I want to understand it completely," and her demand carried authority that surprised even Adrian with its quiet strength. Elena returned to her apartment building with supernatural escorts, invisible in the shadows, Adrian's protection following her through city streets, while her mind struggled to process revelations that had redefined the nature of reality itself. The familiar climb to the third floor felt different now that she knew creatures of legend watched her movements, and the sight of her mother's deteriorated condition struck her with guilt for having spent hours learning about vampire politics, while a mortal woman who had given her life meaning lay dying alone. Maria Santos sat beside the hospital bed that dominated the living room, her fellow nurse's presence bringing comfort that Elena had not realized she needed. But the report of her mother's condition during Elena's absence painted a picture of decline that no medical intervention could reverse. The stress of recent weeks had accelerated the heart failure that doctors had predicted would take months to prove fatal, and Elena's mother lay unconscious, except for brief moments of clarity that came like gifts from a departing spirit. Adrian arrived within minutes of Elena's phone call, his human disguise perfect, except for eyes that held too much sorrow for someone who appeared to be in his early 30s, and his offer to turn Elena's mother into a vampire to save her life sparked an argument that revealed fundamental differences in how they viewed existence itself. Elena rejected the suggestion with horror that surprised Adrian until she explained that her mother had always believed death was a natural transition rather than an enemy to be defeated, that transforming her into an undead creature would violate everything the older woman had taught about accepting life's cycles with grace and dignity. When consciousness returned to Elena's mother for what would prove to be the final time, her eyes focused on Adrian with recognition that made both Elena and the Vampire King realize that maternal intuition had penetrated his supernatural disguise long before the truth had been revealed. "Some love transcends what we think is possible," the dying woman whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying wisdom that made Adrian understand why Elena possessed the compassion that had activated ancient binding magic. She gave her blessing to their relationship with words that absolved Elena of guilt for loving someone whose nature defied human understanding, and her final breath came peacefully, with both her daughter and the Vampire King holding her hands in a vigil that honored the passing of a mortal soul. The funeral service at St. Catherine's Church contrasted human grief rituals with Adrian's ancient perspective on death, his supernatural senses allowing him to perceive the departure of Elena's mother's spirit, while the assembled mourners focused on the physical remains that represented only the smallest part of who she had been. Elena's tears fell like rain on soil that would nourish new growth, her grief profound but not bitter, because her mother's final words had provided the permission she needed to choose love over safety, adventure over security, and a future that promised danger, but also possibilities that mundane existence could never offer. Standing beside her mother's grave as dirt covered the simple casket, Elena made her choice with clarity that surprised her with its certainty, telling Adrian that she would stay with him and face whatever supernatural consequences awaited, but that she refused to be a passive protected object in a world that now claimed her as its own. If she was bound to the Vampire King by ancient magic and cosmic law, she declared, then she would be a queen worthy of the title, a partner rather than a possession, and a bridge between human and vampire worlds that could perhaps prevent the war that Adrian's experiment had been designed to justify. Elena's mother's funeral marked more than the end of a life. It severed the final threads that had anchored her to the purely human world, leaving her suspended between mortality and the supernatural realm that now claimed her as its own. Within days of the burial, Damien Blackthorne made his move with the calculated precision of someone who had been planning insurrection for centuries, appearing before the Vampire Council with formal documents that challenged his brother's fitness to rule. The ornate chamber beneath the city echoed with ancient protocols as Damien presented his case, arguing that Adrian's binding to a human woman proved the king had grown weak and sympathetic to mortals in ways that compromised vampire interests. Elena stood beside Adrian's throne, listening to accusations that painted her as both temptress and weakness, her presence in the sacred chamber a violation of traditions that stretched back to the dawn of vampire civilization. Damien's supporters emerged from the council's shadows like spiders from their webs, vampires whose loyalty had always been conditional and who now saw opportunity in their king's unprecedented emotional attachment. The challenge could not be refused according to laws older than human memory, but vampire tradition demanded that Elena first prove her worthiness through 3 trials that would test every aspect of her character and capabilities. Mordecai announced the testing with ceremonial gravity that made Elena's mortal heart race with anticipation and terror, explaining that failure in any trial would result in her immediate execution and the dissolution of the binding that protected her from vampire law. The first trial took place in an underground arena, carved from living rock. Its circular floor stained with the blood of countless combats stretching back through millennia of vampire justice. Elena faced a warrior named Victor, whose scars spoke of battles fought across European battlefields, his supernatural strength and speed making him a formidable opponent despite the restrictions placed on his actions to prevent accidental death. She entered the arena carrying only her medical bag and the knowledge accumulated through years of emergency medicine, treating the confrontation like a surgical procedure that required precision, timing, and complete understanding of anatomy, both human and supernatural. Victor's first attack came with blurring speed that would have overwhelmed normal human reflexes, but Elena's experience with violent patients had taught her to anticipate aggressive movements and respond with calculated counteractions rather than panicked retreat. Her scalpel, blessed by Father Miguel along with her holy water, opened a precise cut along Victor's forearm that disrupted his supernatural coordination without causing permanent damage, while her knowledge of pressure points allowed her to target areas where even vampire physiology remained vulnerable to skilled manipulation. The assembled court watched in fascination as this human woman displayed warrior instincts wrapped in healer's knowledge, using IV tubing to create temporary restraints and medical supplies to fashion weapons that turned healing tools into implements of strategic combat. Elena's victory came not through overpowering her opponent, but through outthinking him, using her understanding of vampire psychology to predict his attacks while employing medical precision to disable rather than destroy, proving that courage could manifest as healing skill rather than mere willingness to inflict violence. The second trial brought Elena face to face with Cassius, an ancient vampire whose psychic abilities had been honed through centuries of mental manipulation and psychological warfare. His presence in her mind feeling like icy fingers probing through her memories and emotions. Years of dealing with trauma and death in hospital settings had given Elena mental resilience that surprised even herself, her consciousness fortified by exposure to human suffering in all its forms and strengthened by the compassion that had motivated her life's work. Cassius attempted to overwhelm her with visions of violence and despair, flooding her mind with images of vampire-feeding frenzies and the darkest moments of supernatural history. But Elena's psyche had been tempered by witnessing real tragedy and finding meaning in the midst of suffering. Instead of succumbing to the psychic assault, Elena turned the mental connection against her attacker, flooding his ancient consciousness with her memories of human compassion and healing, showing him moments when strangers had helped each other without expectation of reward, when medical professionals had risked their lives to save others, when love had triumphed over circumstances that should have destroyed it. The psychic vampire recoiled from these visions of human nobility like a creature touched by fire, his cynical worldview unable to process the genuineness of Elena's experiences. And his withdrawal from her mind left him stunned and temporarily incapacitated by exposure to emotions he had thought extinct in both human and vampire hearts. The third trial arrived without warning as alarms throughout the vampire kingdom announced an emergency that threatened to expose supernatural existence to the human world above. Rogue vampires had attacked St. Mary's Hospital, Elena's former workplace, turning the institution into a battleground where human patients and staff became casualties in a conflict they could not understand. Elena stood in the council chamber watching security monitors that showed her former colleagues trapped in corridors filled with creatures that moved too quickly for human eyes to track. their screams echoing through speakers that carried sounds of terror no mortal should ever experience. The trial's parameters became clear as Mordecai explained Elena's impossible choice. She could attempt to save human lives by revealing vampire existence to the world, potentially triggering a war between species that would cost millions of lives, or she could protect the supernatural secret while allowing innocent people to die for the sake of maintaining ancient laws about human ignorance. Elena rejected both options with the same decisive clarity that had made her an exceptional nurse, proposing instead a third path that would require perfect coordination between human medical knowledge and vampire supernatural abilities. She contacted Adrian through their binding while simultaneously using her hospital security clearance to access the building's emergency systems, creating a scenario that would explain the violence as a gas leak explosion while providing cover for vampire intervention. Her medical expertise allowed her to guide evacuation procedures that moved patients and staff away from areas where Adrian and his loyal vampires could eliminate the rogues without human witnesses, while her understanding of hospital protocols enabled her to coordinate with emergency responders in ways that supported their cover story. Elena moved through the chaos like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of deception, her voice calm over hospital intercoms as she directed staff evacuations while Adrian's forces engaged the rogue vampires in sections of the building she had cleared of human presence. The trial revealed Elena's natural leadership abilities as she balanced multiple conversations, medical emergencies, and supernatural combat coordination with the multitasking skills that had made her invaluable in trauma situations. Her capacity to bridge human and vampire worlds became evident as she translated between species in real time, explaining vampire tactical advantages to Adrian while interpreting human medical needs for vampires who had forgotten what mortal fragility looked like in practice rather than theory. When the last rogue vampire had been eliminated and the final human casualty stabilized, Elena stood in the hospital's parking lot watching news crews report on a tragic gas explosion that had somehow resulted in fewer casualties than anyone had feared, her cover story holding up under media scrutiny because it contained just enough truth to be believable. The Vampire Council's grudging acknowledgement of her worthiness came with ceremony that felt anticlimactic after the intensity of actual crisis management. But Damien's faction remained hostile despite her proven capabilities, viewing her success as further evidence that Adrian's judgment had been compromised by emotional attachment. Mordecai declared the binding legitimate under ancient law, while warning that external threats were gathering like storm clouds on supernatural horizons. His intelligence networks reporting that vampire courts across Europe and Asia had taken notice of the unprecedented human-vampire union and were sending representatives to evaluate its implications for the larger supernatural world. Elena's education in vampire politics began immediately as she learned to navigate centuries-old protocols while maintaining her medical practice as both cover and personal commitment to human welfare. She insisted on continuing to help human patients despite security concerns, earning grudging respect from vampires who initially saw her dedication to healing as admirable, even if they questioned its wisdom in light of the dangers that surrounded her. Adrian's council chambers became her classroom as Mordecai taught her the intricate relationships between vampire houses, the historical grudges that shaped supernatural diplomacy, and the economic systems that had evolved to manage vampire resources across continents and centuries. Serafina proved an unexpected ally in teaching Elena about vampire military structure and the strategic thinking required to survive in a world where political mistakes could trigger conflicts lasting decades. Her warrior's pragmatism appreciating Elena's quick grasp of tactical concepts and her willingness to ask difficult questions about supernatural warfare. The romantic development between Elena and Adrian deepened beyond the binding's magical compulsion as they shared quiet moments between crises, his centuries of loneliness becoming visible in the way he touched her as if she might disappear, while her mortal perspective helped him rediscover wonder in simple pleasures he had forgotten how to appreciate. Elena learned about Adrian's youth as a human prince in medieval times, his transformation into a vampire to save his dying kingdom, and the gradual erosion of his faith in goodness as he watched humanity's capacity for cruelty play out across centuries of wars and betrayals. Adrian discovered through Elena's eyes how precious mortal time could be, how the brevity of human life gave weight to every moment in ways that immortal existence had taught him to take for granted, and how her kindness had literally saved his soul from the cynicism that had been consuming it like a cancer. Their intimate moments were balanced against growing external pressure as Serafina's intelligence networks brought increasingly troubling reports about ancient vampire courts mobilizing resources and sending delegations toward their territory. The European houses had ruled supernatural politics for millennia and viewed Adrian's American kingdom as an upstart colony that had grown too independent, while the Asian courts saw potential opportunity in the chaos that a human queen might create within traditional vampire power structures. Elena listened to these briefings with the analytical mind that had made her exceptional at medical diagnosis, recognizing patterns in supernatural politics that mirrored human organizational behavior, while noting differences that reflected vampires' extended lifespans and fundamentally different relationship with mortality. Her proposal emerged from weeks of study and observation, a dangerous solution that would either secure their position or destroy them completely. Invite the foreign courts to witness her abilities firsthand, but structure the demonstration to showcase the strength of human-vampire cooperation rather than the weakness that enemies hope to exploit. Elena suggested hosting a supernatural medical conference that would display the advantages of combining human innovation with vampire resources, showing how their partnership could benefit all vampire society rather than threaten it, while providing a controlled environment where she could prove her worthiness to skeptical observers who had traveled thousands of miles to pass judgment on her existence. The plan required perfect execution and carried risks that made even Serafina express concern, but Elena's confidence in her abilities and her understanding of what the foreign courts needed to see convinced Adrian that boldness might be their only path to survival in a supernatural world that viewed change as inherently dangerous and humans as inherently inferior. Elena's carefully orchestrated demonstration began at precisely midnight when coordinated emergencies erupted across 3 major hospitals throughout the city, each crisis requiring both human medical expertise and vampire supernatural capabilities working in perfect synchronization. The visiting vampire courts assembled in hidden observation rooms, equipped with surveillance technology that allowed them to witness every moment of the unfolding drama, their ancient eyes watching as Elena commanded respect from both species while maintaining absolute secrecy about supernatural involvement. St. Mary's Hospital faced a multi-vehicle accident that brought 17 critically injured patients through emergency doors simultaneously, their trauma requiring surgical precision that human hands alone could not provide quickly enough to save every life. Elena moved through the chaos like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of healing, her voice calm over hospital intercoms as she coordinated triage procedures, while Adrian's vampires provided assistance that appeared entirely natural to human observers. At Metropolitan General, a building collapse had trapped construction workers beneath tons of concrete and steel, their rescue requiring supernatural strength to move debris, while human medical knowledge guided treatment of crush injuries that would have been fatal without immediate intervention. Elena's former colleague Maria led the human medical team, while vampire rescuers used their enhanced abilities to reach victims in spaces too dangerous for mortal rescuers, their actions coordinated through Elena's communications network that bridged both worlds seamlessly. The third hospital, Children's Medical Center, became the stage for Elena's most challenging demonstration as a pediatric emergency required surgical procedures that pushed the boundaries of human capability, forcing her to operate with vampire-enhanced precision tools, while Adrian provided supernatural lighting that illuminated surgical fields with clarity no human technology could match. The visiting courts watched through hidden cameras as Elena performed surgery that saved a 7-year-old girl's life, her hands steady and sure as she worked with equipment that had been subtly modified by vampire craftsmanship to exceed normal human medical standards. Elena's partnership with Adrian during the operation showcased their seamless cooperation. His supernatural senses, allowing him to anticipate her needs, while her medical expertise guided procedures that combined human innovation with vampire enhancement in ways that created possibilities neither species could achieve alone. The demonstration impressed representatives from most foreign vampire courts, their millennia of experience recognizing the strategic advantages that human vampire cooperation could provide in both medical and military applications. But the ancient court of Prague remained skeptical despite the evidence presented before their eyes. Countess Elizabeth Bathory emerged from the shadows of the observation room like a figure from nightmare, her beauty preserved across centuries, carrying the terrible perfection that only the oldest vampires possessed, her voice carrying authority that had commanded respect when human civilization was still young. She challenged Elena's worthiness with words that cut like silver blades, claiming that no human possessed the right to bind a vampire king regardless of magical compulsion or demonstrated capabilities, and demanding single combat to settle the question according to laws that predated written history. Elena accepted the challenge with composure that surprised even Adrian, but insisted on terms that would favor her medical knowledge over pure physical conflict, proposing a contest that would test wisdom and healing ability rather than simple capacity for violence. The other vampire courts agreed to witness this unprecedented confrontation, their curiosity about the outcome overriding protocol concerns as they prepared to see whether human intelligence could triumph over supernatural power in direct confrontation. The arena prepared for Elena's battle with Countess Bathory had been modified to resemble a medical facility rather than a traditional combat space, its sterile surfaces and surgical lighting creating an environment where Elena's expertise would have maximum advantage over her opponent's ancient strength. Bathory entered the space with predatory grace that spoke of centuries spent hunting prey across European battlefields, her vampire abilities honed through wars that had shaped the continent's supernatural landscape. But Elena approached the confrontation with the calm focus she brought to emergency surgeries, where split-second decisions determined whether patients lived or died. The fight began with Bathory testing Elena's reflexes through lightning-fast attacks that would have overwhelmed normal human responses, but Elena's experience with violent psychiatric patients had taught her to read body language and anticipate aggressive movements before they became deadly actions. Her medical bag contained instruments that doubled as weapons when necessity demanded, scalpels designed for precision becoming tools of surgical defense, while her knowledge of anatomy allowed her to target pressure points that could disable even supernatural opponents without causing permanent damage. Meanwhile, in the council chambers far below the arena, Damien Blackthorne made his long-planned move against his brother's rule, leading a coup attempt that he had timed to coincide with Adrian's distraction during Elena's battle for legitimacy. The split narrative showed Elena fighting for her life and right to exist in the vampire world, while Adrian faced betrayal from his own blood, Damien's supporters revealing themselves as vampires whose loyalty had always been conditional and whose ambition had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Elena realized during her combat with Bathory that her opponent's attacks carried desperation beneath their fury, the ancient vampire's movements suggesting pain that went deeper than physical injury, and her medical instincts recognized symptoms of an affliction that had been consuming the Countess for centuries. Instead of pressing her advantage when Bathory momentarily faltered, Elena stepped back and offered diagnosis rather than destruction, identifying the ancient curse that had been slowly destroying the Countess's mind and offering healing knowledge that could provide relief from suffering that had lasted longer than most civilizations. The act of mercy toward an enemy who had sought her death transformed the watching vampire court's perception of Elena's character, their ancient minds recognizing that true strength lay in choosing compassion over conquest when victory was within reach, and their approval shifted from skeptical observation to grudging respect for wisdom that transcended species boundaries. Adrian's battle with Damien reached its climax simultaneously, brothers who had shared eternity as vampires facing each other across a divide that had been growing for centuries. Their conflict representing different philosophies about how supernatural power should be exercised in a world that contained both monsters and mortals. Adrian's victory came through superior combat experience and royal vampire abilities that his brother could not match, but his decision to choose exile rather than execution for Damien reflected Elena's influence on his leadership style, showing mercy that his vampiric nature would have rejected before her compassion had awakened his dormant humanity. The vampire world witnessed through this dual confrontation a new kind of leadership that combined strength with compassion, power tempered by wisdom, and the possibility that cooperation between species might achieve more than domination by either humans or vampires alone could accomplish. Countess Bathory's acceptance of Elena's healing offer created an alliance that shifted European vampire politics, while Damien's exile removed the primary internal threat to Adrian's rule without creating martyrdom that execution might have generated among his supporters. The coronation ceremony that followed Elena's victories represented an unprecedented moment in vampire history, as ancient protocols were modified to accommodate a human queen who would remain mortal while ruling alongside her vampire king. The great cathedral chamber beneath the city had been decorated with symbols that bridged human and vampire traditions. Medical caduceus, intertwined with vampire heraldry, flowers that bloomed only in eternal darkness, arranged alongside herbs that carried healing properties recognized by both species. Elena's coronation dress had been crafted by vampire artisans whose skills had been honed across centuries, its fabric incorporating silver threads that would normally repel supernatural creatures, but had been blessed to serve as protection rather than weapon, while medical symbols were embroidered alongside royal vampire regalia to represent her dual role as healer and queen. Representatives from supernatural courts worldwide filled the chamber's carved galleries, their attendance marking acceptance of legitimacy that had been earned through demonstrated capability rather than inherited through bloodline, and their presence established new diplomatic relationships that would reshape vampire politics for generations to come. Adrian's placement of the Queen's ring upon Elena's finger carried ceremony that honored both her human past and vampire future, the new band complementing, rather than replacing, her wedding ring, which had been restored and still carried the memory of her first marriage alongside the promise of her eternal bond with the Vampire King. The ring itself represented union between human heart and vampire royalty, its design incorporating elements that spoke to both traditions while creating something entirely new, just as Elena's reign would bridge worlds that had remained separate throughout recorded history. Elena's first act as queen established hospitals that would secretly serve both human and vampire populations, creating safe spaces where medical treatment would be available regardless of species, and where the healing knowledge she had demonstrated during her trials could be applied to benefit both communities she now served. The announcement of these medical facilities represented more than policy. It symbolized a fundamental shift in how vampire society would interact with the human world, moving from predatory relationship toward cooperative partnership that could benefit both species in ways that isolation had never achieved. Mordecai's formal recognition of the new queen carried weight that extended beyond their immediate kingdom, his ancient authority lending legitimacy to arrangements that would have been impossible under traditional vampire law, while Seraphina's military assessment of the strategic advantages provided by human-vampire cooperation convinced skeptical observers that Elena's reign represented strength rather than weakness. The ceremony concluded with Elena and Adrian standing before their united kingdom, her human mortality balanced against his vampire eternity. their partnership representing hope that love could indeed transcend the boundaries that fear and prejudice had maintained between species for millennia. The assembled courts witnessed not just a coronation, but the birth of a new era in supernatural politics, one where cooperation might replace conquest and where healing could become more powerful than destruction in determining the fate of both human and vampire civilizations. Elena's speech to the gathered vampires emphasized her commitment to serving both worlds while maintaining the secrecy that protected supernatural existence from human discovery. Her words carrying authority earned through trial by combat and proven through demonstration of capabilities that even ancient vampires had been forced to acknowledge. As the ceremony ended and the foreign courts prepared to return to their territories with news of what they had witnessed, Elena and Adrian remained in the cathedral chamber, surrounded by the symbols of their joined reigns, their hands clasped together in a gesture that represented both personal love and political alliance, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring to a kingdom that had chosen innovation over tradition and cooperation over conflict in its approach to governing supernatural citizens who must continue to exist hidden within a human world that remained unaware of their presence. 6 months after Elena's coronation, the rhythm of her dual existence had become as natural as breathing, her mornings spent in surgical scrubs saving human lives, while her evenings were devoted to vampire court proceedings that shaped supernatural policy for centuries to come. The network of medical facilities she had established operated with seamless efficiency, their staff carefully selected from human professionals who possessed both exceptional medical skills and the psychological flexibility to accept truths that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. Dr. Sarah Chen had become Elena's most trusted lieutenant in managing the delicate balance between human medicine and supernatural needs, her brilliant surgical mind adapting to vampire physiology with the same precision she brought to human anatomy, while her discretion ensured that secrets remained protected even under the scrutiny of medical licensing boards and hospital administrators. The Blake Medical Centers had expanded to include facilities in 3 major cities, each one serving as both legitimate healthcare provider and covert treatment center for supernatural patients whose needs could not be met through conventional medicine. Their existence explained through Adrian's continued persona as a philanthropist whose wealth enabled innovative medical research. Elena's relationship with Adrian had evolved beyond the magical binding that had first connected them, deepening into a mature partnership that combined his centuries of accumulated wisdom with her innovative approaches to leadership and problem-solving. Their joint rule had brought unprecedented prosperity to the vampire kingdom, as Elena's emphasis on cooperation and healing complemented Adrian's strategic understanding of supernatural politics, creating policies that strengthened their realm while maintaining the secrecy essential for vampire survival. The human medical professionals Elena had begun training worked alongside vampire staff members who had adapted to daylight schedules and learned to interact with mortals without triggering the predatory instincts that had defined their existence for centuries. Their successful integration proving that cooperation between species was not only possible, but mutually beneficial. Elena's typical day demonstrated the seamless transition she had mastered between her 2 worlds, beginning with a complex cardiac surgery that saved the life of a construction worker whose insurance would never have covered the experimental procedure she performed, followed by afternoon consultations with vampire patients whose supernatural healing abilities required medical intervention that understood both their enhanced capabilities and their unique vulnerabilities. The vampire kingdom had entered an era of stability that surprised even Mordecai, whose millennia of experience had taught him to expect conflict and betrayal as constants in supernatural politics. But Elena's influence had created an environment where cooperation flourished and ancient grudges were set aside in favor of shared prosperity. Evening court proceedings showcased Elena's growing mastery of vampire diplomatic protocols as she mediated disputes between vampire houses with the same calm authority she brought to medical crises. Her human perspective providing solutions that centuries-old immortals had been unable to envision due to their entrenched patterns of thinking. The success of Elena's integration into vampire society had not gone unnoticed by supernatural courts worldwide, with delegations arriving monthly to study the unprecedented arrangement and consider whether similar cooperation might benefit their own territories, though none had yet attempted to replicate the unique circumstances that had made Elena's ascension possible. Elena and Adrian's formal wedding ceremony took place at sunset, in the cathedral chamber beneath the city, the liminal moment between day and night, symbolizing the union of human and vampire time in a celebration that honored both traditions while creating something entirely new. Elena wore her original wedding ring alongside her vampire royal crown, the simple gold band that had started everything now complemented by ancient regalia that marked her as queen of creatures she had once thought existed only in folklore. Her dual symbols representing a past she honored and a future she embraced with equal devotion. The guest list reflected the complexity of their joined worlds, with Elena's medical colleagues attending alongside vampire nobility, human friends who believed Adrian was simply a wealthy philanthropist sharing celebration space with supernatural beings whose true nature remained carefully concealed behind glamour and misdirection. Dr. Chen and Maria sat in the front row wearing evening gowns that had been gifts from vampire craftsmen, their presence representing Elena's continued connection to her human origins, while their acceptance of unexplained mysteries demonstrated the trust that had developed between species during months of careful cooperation. Adrian's vampire council occupied places of honor, decorated with banners that bore both blackthorn heraldry and medical symbols. Mordecai's ancient dignity, lending gravitas to proceedings that marked a new chapter in vampire history, while Seraphina's military bearing had softened into something approaching maternal pride as she watched her king find happiness that had eluded him for centuries. Representatives from allied supernatural courts filled the cathedral's carved galleries, their attendance marking diplomatic recognition of the legitimacy Elena had earned through demonstrated capability rather than inherited bloodline, their presence ensuring that news of this unprecedented union would spread throughout the supernatural world as evidence of new possibilities for cooperation between species. The ceremony began with vows exchanged in English that human guests could understand, Elena's words emphasizing her commitment to healing both worlds while promising to bridge the gap between human compassion and vampire strength in service of all those who would benefit from their united leadership. Adrian's response in the human tongue spoke of protecting Elena's mortality while sharing immortal love that would endure beyond the brief span of human years, his voice carrying emotion that made even ancient vampires remember what it felt like to love someone whose time was measured in decades rather than centuries. The second exchange of vows took place in the ancient vampire language that predated human civilization, words of binding that carried magical weight and created connections that transcended legal ceremony. Elena's pronunciation carefully practiced under Mordecai's tutelage, while Adrian's responses invoked protections and promises that reached into realms of supernatural law that governed immortal relationships. The reception that followed showcased the harmony Elena and Adrian had created between their worlds. Human music played by musicians who had no idea their audience included creatures old enough to have inspired the legends their songs celebrated, while vampire traditions were observed through ceremonies that appeared to human guests like elaborate theatrical performances rather than ancient rituals with genuine supernatural significance. Mortal food prepared by human caterers shared table space with delicacies that only vampire palates could appreciate. The careful segregation, ensuring that human guests remained unaware of dietary preferences that would have raised uncomfortable questions about their host's true nature and the reality of creatures they shared celebration space with unknowingly. 1 year after their wedding, Elena's discovery of her pregnancy created ripples of shock that spread through both human and vampire worlds, the impossible biological reality forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the boundaries between mortal and immortal existence. The conception should have been medically impossible according to every law of vampire physiology that Mordecai's ancient knowledge encompassed. Yet Elena's pregnancy proceeded with normalcy that defied supernatural expectations, while creating possibilities that no prophecy had fully anticipated. Adrian's revelation of ancient texts that spoke of hybrid children who could bridge supernatural and human worlds permanently added historical context to their personal miracle. Prophecies written in languages that predated written history, suggesting that their child might possess abilities that could transform the relationship between species in ways that simple cooperation had only begun to achieve. Elena's establishment of a medical research foundation provided cover for studies that secretly explored supernatural healing. Her legitimate scientific credentials, allowing her to investigate vampire regenerative abilities and supernatural disease resistance without triggering suspicion from human medical establishments that would have demanded explanations she could never provide. The research facility operated under the guise of investigating rare genetic conditions and experimental treatments, its work advancing human medical knowledge while simultaneously developing therapies that could benefit vampire physiology in ways that previous centuries had never imagined possible. Elena's pregnancy had progressed normally through its first trimester despite the unprecedented nature of human vampire conception, her body adapting to carry a child whose heritage included both mortal limitations and immortal possibilities, while Adrian's protective instincts had intensified beyond anything his vampire nature had previously experienced. The underground kingdom had transformed during Elena's year as queen, its chambers now filled with both vampires and carefully selected humans working together on projects that ranged from medical research to cultural exchange, their cooperation proving that the barriers between species had been maintained by fear and misunderstanding rather than fundamental incompatibility. Elena's dual role as healer and queen had created opportunities for advancement that neither species could have achieved alone. Vampire strength and longevity combining with human innovation and adaptability to produce solutions to problems that had plagued both communities for generations. The child growing in Elena's womb represented more than personal happiness. It symbolized hope for a future where the boundary between human and vampire might become permeable rather than absolute, where cooperation could evolve into true integration that benefited both species without compromising the essential nature of either. Elena still wore both her original wedding ring and her vampire crown during formal occasions. The simple gold band that had activated ancient binding magic, now accompanied by regalia, that marked her as queen of creatures who had learned to value healing above dominance, compassion above conquest, and cooperation above the isolation that had defined vampire existence for millennia. As Elena and Adrian walked through their kingdom's corridors, discussing plans for their child's future, they passed laboratories where human scientists worked alongside vampire researchers, medical facilities where both species received treatment that combined the best of mortal knowledge with supernatural capabilities, and meeting rooms where diplomatic protocols were being rewritten to accommodate realities that previous generations had thought impossible. The final image of their story showed Elena placing her hand on her growing belly, while Adrian's cold fingers covered hers with gentleness, that spoke of wonder at the miracle they had created together. Their child representing the ultimate proof that love could indeed conquer boundaries that fear and prejudice had maintained between species, and that the future might hold possibilities that neither human nor vampire imagination had been capable of envisioning alone.